Welcome to Double Portion Inheritance with Maria Merola and Gary Wold, brought to you by DoublePortionInheritance.com. Since 1981, Maria heard the call of Yahuwah to become a watchman to the house of Yisrael and to those within the traditional Christian church. She was instructed to warn them against the false doctrines and pagan traditions of men. After 25 years of studying Scripture, the word of Yahuwah came to Maria again in 2007 as she was called out of the corporate world to become a full-time intercessor and prophetic teacher. The name of the ministry, Double Portion Inheritance, was given to her after she received the revelation of the two houses of Yisrael from Ezekiel 37:16. The mission of this ministry is to bring together the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph for the return of the Messiah, Yahushua. And now, Maria Merola.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Today is April 30th, 2022, and we are going to be doing part 2 of the Aleph Taw, the red heifer, and the two sticks. So last week we talked about, these two letters in Hebrew called the Aleph and the Taw. We discussed the bronze serpent on the pole. So go back to part 1 if you want to learn about that. That's kind of a controversial subject. And we talked about Genesis 1:1, which is the first place we see in the Hebrew text the Aleph and the Taw. The Aleph looks like the head of an ox, and the Taw is a cross. And so in Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning, Elohim created, and this is in the Hebrew text. It doesn't appear in the English, because in English it has no meaning. It says, in the beginning, Elohim created, Aleph and Taw, the heaven, which is Shamayim, and there's Wah, Aleph, and Taw. Okay, so the Wah means the nail or the hook or the tent peg, and the Aleph looks like the head of an ox or a red heifer, and then there's the two sticks of Ezekiel 37. So these letters paint a picture. It's a picture of our Messiah who was the red heifer. He portrayed the red heifer on the day that he was crucified. Not only did he portray the Passover lamb, he also portrayed the red heifer, which we'll talk about more in the study, and also the nail. Of course, he was nailed to the tree. And then there's the two sticks, the stick of Judah, the stick of Ephraim. He made both one stick in his hand. And then here I showed last week the different stages of the Hebrew alphabet. It started with the early, pictograph Hebrew, which is, they call it Proto-Sinaitic, and then the middle, which is Paleo, and then here's the late, and now this is the modern Hebrew letters that they look like, they call them box letters. Okay. And we talked about how the word cross in the New Testament scriptures, of course, it's stauros, and it means a pole or a stake, but it also means self-denial. That's why in Galatians, when the Apostle Paul or Shaul says, Elohim forbid that I should glory save in the cross of our Master, Yahushua HaMashiach, what does he mean when he says, Elohim forbid that I should glory save in the cross? Okay, so what he means is, Elohim, forbid that I should glory except in anything else except for the cross. Save, let me see if I can find it. Here it is. It's in Galatians 6:4. He says, but Elohim forbid that I should glory save in the cross of our Master Yahushua HaMashiach, by whom the world is crucified unto me, and I unto the world. So at first glance, if you really don't understand what Paul's trying to say, you would think, well, why would he glory in a cross? Isn't that a pagan symbol? That's how most people think. They're like, well, Paul's acting like he's glorying in a cross. That's a pagan symbol. No, Paul's not talking about the image of the cross. He's talking about the self-denial. Because see, this word stauros isn't just talking about the noun, the object of the cross or the pole or the stake. It's also talking about the concept of denying oneself. Okay? That's why Yahushua said, If any man will be my disciple, let him take up his what? Cross, and deny himself, right? Right here, it's in Yahu 16:24. He said, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And then in Mark 8:34, he says it again. And when he had called the people unto him with his disciples also, he said unto them, whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And then, of course, in Luke 9:23, and he said unto them, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. So in 3 Gospels, he says the same thing effectively. To take up your cross is talking about denying oneself. Okay? So that's what the Apostle Shaul or Paul meant when he talked about, that the only thing that he, gloried in was the self-denial of our Messiah. In other words, he was saying that's what he was focused on. He says, I'm focused on the self-denial of our Messiah. And so that's what he meant by that. And then, of course, now we talked about the fact that there were 2 different instruments. And a lot of people don't understand this. There were 2 different instruments that he was nailed to. The piece that he carried to the place of the skull, he didn't carry the whole cross. Archaeologists, I learned that archaeologists found that the entire piece, the stauros, and the crossbeam that he carried across his shoulder, if he had carried that entire thing, it would have weighed 375 pounds. And there's no way he could have carried that, especially after being whipped on the back. He was weakened. And what we find here is that there's 3 places in the book of Acts 5:30, Acts 10:39, and also in Acts 13:29, where it says he was nailed to a tree. But see, the word tree is this word zulon or xylon. Sometimes it's pronounced xylon, sometimes zulon, but that word, it says a beam from which anyone is suspended, a gibbet, a cross, a log or timber with holes in which the feet, hands, neck of prisoners were inserted and fastened with tongs. So he carried 2 different, he only carried the cross beam. He didn't carry the whole stauros, okay? But, the Jehovah's Witnesses teach that it was just a single pole because they can't imagine that it was a cross because, the Catholic Church has hijacked this symbol and they've turned it into an idol. So everybody thinks the cross is something pagan, but it didn't start out as something pagan. Satan hijacks everything and turns it into something pagan. Now, if you have a wooden cross in your house and you bow down and pray to the wooden cross, then you're treating it like an idol. But is it a sin to recognize that he was nailed to a cross? Of course not. It's just a prophetic picture of the 2 sticks. That's a Roman crucifixion. That's what they called it. Romans did a crucifixion. The Latin word crucifixion comes from the root word crux, crux, crux. Crux, we've all heard the word, well, the crux of the matter is this. We've heard that word crux. That's the Latin word for crucified. Okay, so the fact that he was crucified on a Roman cross is proof that it was a cross, because the mere word crucifixion comes from the word crux in Latin, which means cross. So we know it was a cross. If anybody tries to tell you it wasn't a cross, they're not being intellectually honest with the whole counsel of Scripture. And then, of course, last week we talked about the laminin cell. Any medical journal that you look in will tell you that we have these cells inside of our bodies called laminin cells. And if we didn't have these, we would literally fall apart. Our bodies would fall apart. These hold our bodies together. And what's interesting about that is even the scriptures tell us right here in Ephesians 2:15 through 16, it says, having abolished in his flesh the enmity. That word enmity means hatred, because obviously there's hatred even to this day between the two houses of Israel, between Jews and Gentiles, between the house of Ephraim and the house of Yehuda. You even still see Hebrew roots people acting like Jews are the synagogue of Satan. That's what they say. They say, oh, Jews are the synagogue of Satan, and they just constantly make these broad brush statements about all Jews, which is completely unfair because it's just not true. There are tons of Jews in Israel right now coming to know Yahushua as the Messiah, and even Orthodox Jews. So don't make these broad brush statements, because you will be held accountable. You will be judged for speaking against Yahushua's people. And so he abolished in his flesh this hatred, this enmity, okay? Even the law of commandments contained in ordinances. Well, what does that mean? Well, he's talking about rabbinical law, because, see, back in those days, the Yahudim, the Jews, they placed a fence around around the outer court, a wall of partition. Paul Shaul talks about this wall of partition. And they didn't want any of the returning tribes, like the Samaritans who came out of the Assyrian captivity. They didn't want them to assimilate back into the kingdom of Judah because of what it says in Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 says that once a man divorces his wife and she marries another man, and the other man divorces her also, or he dies, she may not go back to the first husband, because if she does, it will cause the land to be defiled. So the Jews, the Yahudim, thought to themselves, well, we can't let these returning tribes come back in the land. They'll defile the land. In their minds, they looked at it like, yeah, we can't let them come back, because Deuteronomy 24 says that this is an abomination. So I understand their way of thinking and how they were rationalizing this. But you see, they were wrong, because they were still ignoring the rest of prophecy. Because in the book of Hosea, Yahushua said that he would marry Israel again. So he made a way. He made it possible to marry Israel again. And the way that he did that was he died. And when he died, that basically nullified the original marriage covenant so that he could establish a renewed covenant. So the law of divorce died with him. The law of divorce that prevented Israel from marrying him again, that law died with him. And so therefore he could marry her again, because he was effectively starting with a new marriage covenant. And so, but the rules and regulations, the instructions, the Torah, the terms and the conditions of the covenant did not change. But, Christians think that just because the law of commandments were abolished, according to this is talking about the laws of the rabbis. They put up a wall of partition, preventing the other 10 northern tribes from coming back into the land. That's what he abolished, the law of commandments contained in ordinances. For to make in himself of two, meaning the two houses, to make in himself of two one new man, and that he might reconcile both unto Elohim in one body by the cross. You see that? The laminin cell holds our bodies together. Yahushua, by his cross, is holding the two houses of Israel together. You see what a beautiful prophetic picture he has given us. I mean, all of creation testifies testifies of the gospel. The good news of Mashiach is evident in all of creation. Even these tiny microscopic cells. He did this on purpose because he's always trying to show us. He's trying to teach us through his creation. The gospel is there at every turn. You can't get away from it. Okay? And so we talked about this last week. All right. So, in Jeremiah 11:16, Yahuwah called Israel a green olive tree. That's the first time he called them a green olive tree. And so this one olive tree became two separate trees in 1 Kings chapter 12 when Judah and Ephraim became two separate nations under King Jeroboam and under King Rehoboam. And so when Shaul talks about these two groups in Ephesians 2, now you understand. You have to read 1 Kings chapter 12 and understand what led to these two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel becoming two separate nations. So here he's saying, wherefore remember that you, being in time past Goyim, Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by that which is called circumcision in the flesh, made by hands. What does he mean? So he's talking about the Goyim, the Gentiles, in other words, those 10 lost tribes, those northern tribes that Yahuwah divorced in Jeremiah 3:8. He wrote them a certificate of divorce and divorced them because of their idolatry, and they went into exile with the Assyrians. Now the Jews also, the kingdom of Judah also went into captivity with the Babylonians, but he didn't divorce them. And the reason he didn't wasn't because they didn't deserve it, because they did. But the only reason he didn't divorce them is because in Genesis 49:10, Jacob already said, the scepter will not depart from Judah until a lawgiver, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. In other words, when Messiah returns, right? So Messiah is the ultimate lawgiver. And when he comes, he's going to step onto the throne of King David and take over the scepter. So the thing is that the Gentiles were divorced by Yahuwah. Okay. And so Paul's saying to those that are born again, those of us that have come to know the Messiah, he says, remember that you, being in times past Gentiles, in other words, we were former Gentiles. Now we're no longer called Gentiles. And he says that we were called Gentiles that we are called uncircumcision, right? By those that are called the circumcision. In other words, the Yahudim, the Jews, are called the circumcision, and those that are called Gentiles are called the uncircumcision, okay? And he's saying that the Yahudim are circumcision in the flesh, made by hands. In other words, they're outwardly circumcised in the flesh, but if they're not born again, then their hearts are still uncircumcised. And then he says, at that time you were without Mashiach, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without Elohim in the world. But now in Mashiach, Yahushua, you who sometimes were far off are made near by the blood of Mashiach. For he is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of partition between us. See, there's that middle wall of partition that I was talking about. Okay, the middle wall of partition was that wall that they literally built around the temple. And if any Gentile, any returning member of the lost tribes, like the Samaritans, wanted to come to the temple to hear the scriptures being read on the Sabbath day, they were forbidden. That wall prevented them. In fact, they would be killed if they tried to enter the temple because they were considered unclean, spiritually speaking. They believed that these Gentiles coming into the temple to hear the scriptures being read on the Sabbath day would defile the temple. And see, technically speaking, they were right, but prophetically speaking, they were wrong, if that makes sense. They were going by the letter of the law, the letter of the Torah, but they were ignoring the spirit of the Torah, okay? And they were taking the law so literally that they didn't recognize that the prophetic word said that Yahushua would die for the sins of Israel, thereby allowing them to come back into covenant and allowing them to be married to him again. They didn't see that. So he abolished in his flesh the law of commandments contained in ordinances. This word ordinances in Greek is dogma. That word dogma is man-made doctrine, okay? And so he abolished the hatred between Jews and Gentiles, even these man-made doctrines that caused the Pharisees, the religious leaders, to put up a wall around the temple. You know, the commandments of the Pharisees contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of two one new man, that he might reconcile both unto Elohim in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity, the hatred, and came and preached peace to you which were afar off, and to them that were near. So those that are near were the Jews, the Yehudim, that were in the kingdom of Judah already, but those that were afar off were like the prodigal sons, right? They were the house of Ephraim, the 10 northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes of Ephraim. And they were the ones that were afar off. So this explains why Yahushua had to be escorted outside the city limits of Jerusalem. He took the stick of Judah on his shoulder, right? And where did he take it? Afar off, outside the city limits, right? And he brought the stick of Judah to the stick of Ephraim. He made them one stick by the cross, okay? And, you know, so I talked about this last week. And let's see, where were we last week? So what were these ordinances that our Messiah abolished in his flesh? Well, in Numbers chapter 5, there is an ordinance called the law of jealousy. This is for when a wife is suspected of having committed adultery. She must drink bitter water, and if she is guilty, her belly will swell and her thigh will rot. The high priest must write down the curses against her in a book of remembrance, and then he must blot out the curses against her with the bitter water. If the wife is innocent, then she will go home and conceive with her husband. Okay, now our Messiah, as the high priest, Melchizedek, blotted out the curses against the adulterous wife Israel. And when he returns, she, Jerusalem, will give birth to what? The man-child. Revelation 12 tells us that she will give birth to a man-child, or in other words, the one new man. See that? In other words, the ordinances in Deuteronomy 24 called the law of divorce, he blotted that out. So when a husband finds any uncleanness in his wife, that means marital unfaithfulness, he may write her a divorce decree, put it into her hand, and send her away. However, the husband who divorces her may never take her back again. That's only if she remarries. Now, if she doesn't get remarried, he can take her back. But in this instance, Israel did get married again. How do we know? Because, see, in Hosea chapter 2, we are told that she went after her lovers. And we are told that she went after her Baalim. But how do we know that she married them? Because she said, I will go back to my first husband. Well, where does it say that she will go back to her first husband? Let me find it. Oh, here it is. Hosea 2:7. And she shall follow after her lovers, but she shall not overtake them. And she shall seek them, but she shall not find them. Then shall she say, I will go and return to my first husband. Well, if she had a first husband, this implies there's a second one, right? Why would Hosea the prophet say she had a first husband unless there was a second one?
I think probably one of the reasons that's confusing to people is because it says she went after her lovers, but she could not overtake them. So it makes it seem like she chased after them, but she never got possession.
Well, I think what it's saying is that initially she did overtake them, but he's basically saying there's going to come a point where he's going to put a stop to it and she's not going to be able to anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah, could be. And it also goes on to say she shall seek them but not find them. She keeps moving from lover to lover or quote unquote marriage to marriage.
Yeah. He says, for their mother has played the harlot. So he's talking past tense and saying their mother, meaning Israel, has played the harlot. She that conceived them has done shamefully, for she said, I will go after my lovers that give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. Because, see, they sacrificed to these false gods because they believed that if they did that they would prosper financially and that they would have a good outcome with their crops and they would have a good harvest and all of this kind of thing.
Right. Christina made the comment, I know we don't always take comments, but she made the comment in the chat that this connects to the woman at the well so beautifully. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things we talk about.
That's right.
When he said that, yes, you've been married, you've been with 5 others, and he was basically saying that you've been in multiple marriages.
That's right.
And for those who don't know the Hebrew culture, she knew and he knew that she was off limits to be restored to Israel.
Right, unless he gave her that living water which she asked for.
Exactly. And again, only Yahuwah really understood the miracle of how he was going to achieve this. Prophetically, we knew Messiah was coming. We knew Yahuwah himself would make salvation, but it was inconceivable to most Hebrews, most Jews.
Yeah, so first he's speaking in the past tense and saying right here in Hosea 2:2, he says, plead with your mother. Because see, Hosea the prophet got married to a woman named Gomer, who was a woman of harlotry. Yahuwah told him to marry this woman of harlotry. And he had children with this woman. So Ami and to your sister's Rahuama. And then he says, plead with your mother, for she is not my wife. Why? Because he put her away. He says, neither am I her husband. Let her therefore put away her whoredoms out of her sight and her adulteries from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked and set her as in the day that she was born and make her as a wilderness and set her like a dry land and slay her with thirst. And he says, and I will not have mercy upon her children, for they be children of whoredoms. So in the past, she did go and play the harlot. But then he says what he's going to do to put a stop to it. He says, therefore, I will hedge up your way with thorns and make a wall. There's that wall that Paul was talking about, right? I will hedge up your way with thorns and make a wall that she shall not find her path. Okay? And she will follow after her lovers and she will not overtake them. In other words, there's going to come a point where he's going to say, enough is enough. You're not going to be able to overtake your lovers anymore. And she will seek after them and she will not find them. Then shall she say, I will go and return to my first husband, for then it was better with me than now. So here's Israel recognizing that things were better for her when she was in a covenant relationship with Yahuwah. And she says, I will go back to my first husband. But wait a minute. Deuteronomy 24 says that can't be done. He can't marry her again, okay, because she's already gotten married to this other husband, this second husband. And if you keep on reading further down, he says, I will betroth you. That's talking about being engaged. I will betroth you unto me forever. Yea, I will betroth you unto me in righteousness and in judgment and in loving kindness and in mercies. And I will even betroth you unto me in faithfulness, and you shall know Yahuwah. So there's a problem here. How could he make such a promise when Deuteronomy 24 says that's not possible? Okay? When a man has taken a wife and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. So she is allowed to get remarried, okay? However, if the latter husband hates her and writes her a bill of divorcement and gives it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies, which took her to be his wife, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. After that, she is defiled, for this is an abomination before Yahuwah, and you shall not cause the land to sin, which Yahuwah your Elohim gives you for an inheritance. Now we understand why the Yehudim, the Jews, would not let the Samaritans come back. They weren't just being hateful for no reason. They were seriously afraid to let the Samaritans come back in the land because they didn't want to violate the Torah. They just got back from being in captivity with the Babylonians. And so in their minds, they're thinking, we have to be so careful. We just came out of captivity ourselves with the Babylonians. If we let these Samaritans come in, then we're going to be judged all over again. So in their minds, they saw this as there's no way we could let these 10 northern tribes come back. Yahuwah divorced them. He didn't divorce Judah, though. Because why? If he would have divorced the kingdom of Judah, Judah and Benjamin, the two southern tribes, if he would have divorced them, there would be nothing left of the house of Israel. He had to let there remain a remnant because the Messiah was prophesied to be born into the tribe of Judah. So he had, even though Judah deserved to be divorced, he still had to allow Judah to remain so that there would be a tribe for the Messiah to be born into. Okay? So I told all of this because when our Messiah died on the two trees, see, it was two trees. It was the crossbeam that he carried across his shoulder, and then there was another one already standing there when he arrived at the place of the skull. So when he died on the two trees of the two sticks, the law of divorce was canceled out, nullified, making Israel a widow, okay? And she was no longer a divorced woman. She was no longer an adulteress. She was just a widow, okay? Because she crucified her own Messiah, okay? But now she's allowed to be married again. He is allowed to marry her legally. Okay, so the two sticks are the two trees of Ephraim and Yehudah. Now we can see from this illustration the two sticks of Ezekiel 37, 15 through 19. As you can see, Yehudah is on one stick, and then Ephraim is on the other stick. Okay? As we can see from this illustration, there's a very good reason why Yahuwah created the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet, the Taw, to be in the shape of a cross. He was illustrating through this Hebrew letter that the two houses of Israel being made one body by the cross was him partially fulfilling Okay, there's an intermediate fulfillment when he was crucified, but there's an even future fulfillment to Ezekiel's prophecy when he totally makes us one. Okay, but at that time he made us one in the spirit. He made the house of Yehuda and Ephraim one in the spirit, to those who believe, to those who understand what was done. We can lay hold on that promise and we can recognize what was done in the spirit. But in the natural, in the in the cosmos, in the physical world, it hasn't been fully, implemented yet, because not everybody is on the same page. But when he returns on Yom Kippur, on that day when he lands his feet on the Mount of Olives, that's when he is going to finally bring both houses together fully. Not only will we be one in the spirit, we will be one house, one bride, one stick. We will be one in the natural. Okay, there'll be no difference between Yehudim and Goyim. No difference between Jew and Gentile. Okay, so in other words, as far as what we get to inherit. Okay, so our Messiah was crucified on two sticks because his hands were stretched out, and this symbolizes our horizontal relationship with each other, with one another. So the horizontal stick represents our horizontal relationship with each other. That's why Yahushua talked about the two greatest commandments in the Torah. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. He says, you shall love Yahuwah your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. That's Matthew 22:37. That is the vertical stick. That's our vertical relationship with Yahuwah. But then he says the second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew 22:39. So that is the horizontal relationship we have with each other. So you see, the two sticks has so many prophetic layers of prophetic meaning to it. You'll notice that the first and greatest of all these commandments involves loving Yahuwah, and this is our vertical relationship with him. But the second greatest commandment involves loving others, and this is a horizontal relationship. Therefore, our Messiah was nailed to a taw, the last Hebrew letter, which was made out of two trees or two sticks for the two houses of Israel. Okay, he's reconciled both Ephraim and Yehuda, Judah, Jew and Gentile, by the taw, by the cross. Okay, so even though the pagans, the heathens, have hijacked this symbol and they've used it as an object of worship for Tammuz, or Mithra, you see, before the foundations of the world, Yahuwah already ordained that this letter Taw, the Taw, would be the mark that he marks his elect with in their foreheads. All those who receive a mark in their foreheads receive the Taw. In fact, in Ezekiel, Yechezkel, chapter 9, verse 4, Yahuwah said, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Yerushalayim, and he says, to set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and that cry for all the abominations that be done in the midst thereof. And that word for mark is the Taw. In fact, it actually says wall, Aleph, and Taw. The same thing that we see in Genesis 1:1. The nail, the red heifer, and the cross. That's the mark. Now, I know the Catholic Church has tried to imitate this thing where they put ashes on your forehead, for the cross. They put it, on Ash Wednesday. They put the cross on your forehead with ashes. Okay. But, that's just what the Catholic Church does. They always, hijack things out of the Bible and they kind of put their own perverted twist on it. But Yahuwah, he doesn't tell us to do it because he's the one that does it. He's the one that does it supernaturally. So the mark that Yahuwah puts on the forehead of those that sigh and that cry for all the abominations that are done in Jerusalem in the last days. That is the wall, Aleph, and Taw. It's the nail, the red heifer, and the cross. The same thing we see in Genesis 1:1. Okay? It's a symbol of our Messiah. Now, I believe that all those who did not take that snake bite over the last couple of years, that they have Yahuwah's mark on them. The Aleph, the wall, Aleph, and Taw. The stick, the two sticks, the red heifer, and the nail. Okay? And you'll notice two different words in this passage. Tava and Tav. The word Tava means to mark out, and the Tav means a mark. Okay? So T-A-V, the way that's spelled, Tav, it stands for the Taw, the Aleph, and the Vav is supposed to be a W, which is a wall. So the word Taw itself spells out T-A-W, Taw, okay? Taw, Aleph, and wall, okay? Hence, what it really is saying is mark out a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and cry for all the abominations that be done in the midst thereof. So you can see those who are against the abominations that are mentioned in Ezekiel 8, in other words, pagan sun god worship. It tells us in the previous chapter the abominations that they're doing in Yahuwah's temple. He says that they have the image of jealousy. What is the image of jealousy? Well, we know that is, the phallic symbol. It's the Washington Monument. It's the steeples on top of church buildings. It's the Christmas tree. They're all phallic symbols. They're supposed to represent Nimrod's, uncircumcised phallus. And so Yahuwah told Ezekiel, look at what these people are doing in my temple. They're weeping. The women are weeping for Tammuz. He says they put the branch to the nose. That's mistletoe, right? They have an image of jealousy. In other words, a Christmas tree in a church or a steeple on top of a building. These are all abominations. And he says, but those who sigh and cry, those who are grieved in their spirit about these abominations that they see going on in Jerusalem in the end of days, these have the mark. Yahuwah marks them with the Taw, okay? And it's the abomination that causes desolation in the end of days. There's going to be an abominable image that is going to be erected in the temple in Jerusalem. That's going to be the ultimate abomination. It says in Daniel's prophecy, in Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11, and also in Daniel chapter 12, it says that the false Messiah takes away the daily sacrifices, and in its place, he sets up an image, an abominable image that causes Jerusalem to become desolate, the abomination of desolation. In Revelation 13:14, it's called the image of the beast. It's going to be an abominable image. And those that sigh and cry, those that, are preaching against it, the two witnesses, they're going to be in that city where our master was crucified. And those that are crying out and they are screaming out against these abominations, they have that mark in their foreheads. Okay? So the wall, the nail or the tent peg, the hay represents the breath or the spirit of Yahuwah. Okay? The Taw is the cross, the wall, the nail or the tent peg. The yod is the arm of Yahuwah. The Taw, once again, is the cross. So this word Tava, it's really Tawa. Tawa is how it would be, because there's no V sound in ancient Hebrew. It's a W sound. Tauwa, okay? Tauwa is how you would say it. So these letters, the nail or the tent peg, the hay is the breath, the Taw is the cross, the wall is the nail or tent peg, the yod is the arm. Okay, and then there's another taw at the end. So this word Tawua contains the Hebrew letters. It's saying that there's 2 nails, okay, for his hands and for his feet. There are also 2 tent pegs for the 2 houses of Israel, or 2 tents of Jacob. And by the inspiration or the breath of Yahuwah, Messiah, who is the arm of Yahuwah, was sent to die on these 2 sticks. In other words, he was sent to die on the cross or the taw for the 2 houses of Israel. And those who have faith in his finished work on the cross, in other words, if they have faith in the taw, in what he did on the taw, they receive his mark. The xylon, or the crossbeam, is the burden of Ephraim. You see, in the book of Jeremiah, we're going to learn that they thought that the Torah was a burden, okay? And I'm going to go there right now on my eSword. Let's see, burden of the Lord is how it's worded in the King James, but I'm just for the sake of finding it quickly. It's right here. It's Jeremiah 17. It says, "Thus says Yahuwah, take heed to yourselves and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gates of Yerushalayim." And then in verse 24 it says, "And it shall come to pass, if you diligently hearken unto me, says Yahuwah, to bring in no burden through the gates of the city on the Sabbath day, but hallow the Sabbath to do no work." Okay, so that's not what I wanted. This is what I wanted right here. Jeremiah 23:33. "And when this people or the prophet or a priest shall ask you, saying, what is the burden of Yahuwah? You shall then say unto them, what burden? I will even forsake you, says Yahuwah." And then in verse 34 he says, "As for the prophet and the priest and the people that shall say the burden of Yahuwah, I will even punish that man and his house." And then in verse 36, "And the burden of Yahuwah shall you mention no more, for every man's word shall be his burden, for you have perverted the words of the living Elohim." And right here in verse 38, "But since you say the burden of Yahuwah, therefore thus says Yahuwah, because you say this word, the burden of Yahuwah, and I have sent unto you, saying, you shall not say the burden of Yahuwah." See, what is he talking about? It's the same thing Christianity says today. Oh, the law is a burden. Nobody can keep the Torah. Jeremiah, 33. The word burden is masa, a burden, specifically a tribute. That would be like taxation, a mental burden, So, but see, the implication was that these people were saying, oh, the Torah is a burden. You know how Christianity, they say, oh, it's too hard. We can't keep the Torah. It's too hard. Nobody can keep the Torah. They were complaining and saying that the burden, that Yahuwah has burdened us with this Torah. Okay? So because of that, what did Messiah do? He bore our burdens, right? He carries the burden across his shoulder, trying to show us, if I can bear this burden, you can keep the Torah.
Yeah, I mean, let's say that differently, right? Yahuwah is angry because people are murmuring, just like in the desert.
Right.
Saying how hard they have it. We want the leeks and all these other things. Mm-hmm. And all we have to eat is this honey-like bread that we have to collect every day. How hard, mm-hmm. right? So they're saying, your yoke, your burden is too hard for us.
Right.
But it's really not hard. They're just being selfish and want variety. Mm-hmm. And there really isn't a burden per se, but they're calling it a burden. Yahuwah's provision as being burdensome. And then Yahushua, his burden was to carry the sins of the world. Mm-hmm. Right. So Yahuwah's upset because they're calling his provision and his protection a burden. That's not cool. You're speaking a curse upon yourselves.
Right. I was trying to remember that passage where he says that the Torah is not too hard for you. It's Deuteronomy 30:11. Okay. So in Deuteronomy 30:11, he tells us that the Torah is not too hard for you. Okay. He says, for this commandment, which I command you this day, it is not hidden from you, neither is it far off. Okay. There's that word far off. Because why? The house of Ephraim, the 10 northern tribes, he sent them afar off because they thought that this book, this law was too hard, that it was too burdensome for them, right? So he said, it's not hidden from you. It's not too hard, you know? He says, it is not in heaven. You know, in other words, the Torah is not in heaven that you should say, who shall go up for us to heaven and bring it unto us that we may hear it and do it. He says, neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who shall go over the sea for us and bring it unto us that we may hear it and do it. And he says, but the word is very near unto you in your mouth and in your heart that you may do it. He says, so he's saying it's not too hard. It's not a burden. It's easy. I've made it easy for you. Not only have I given it to you written in stone, but I've also made it written it in your heart. He says, I've made it possible to be written in your heart. You know, he's saying, I've put it in your mouth. I've put it in your heart so that you can do it. Okay. So he bore the burdens because why? The people in Jeremiah were complaining, oh, the burden of Yahuwah, he's burdening us with all these commandments. And Yahushua bears this burden to show them it's not too hard. Look at me. I'm taking your burden. My yoke is easy and my burden is light.
And can I just say this one more thing? I want to say this a second time, maybe in a slightly different way. The burden that he carried for us to show us was his 3.5 years walking righteously.
That's right.
The burden of the cross was not the same burden. The cross, again, was sin. So what he carried and showed the nation that you can do is it is possible to walk in Torah. No one's going to be without sin ever, but we can walk according to the principles of Torah, and it's not too hard. The sin that he bore on himself was their murmuring and the punishment of sin in general, you know, for all people.
Right. And
they're two separate burdens.
And as he's carrying this, he's showing them, oh, is this what you think of my Torah? Look at how you act like this Torah is so burdensome. You know what I mean? You know, this is why, you know, in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 29, he says, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. You see, Simon of Cyrene, who was a Gentile, carried his burden for him. Isn't that interesting? You have a Gentile helping him carry this burden. It was like, I don't know how to explain this, but it was like poetic justice, if you will. It was like a slap in the face to the Yahudim, the Jews, to say, even this Gentile is willing to carry this burden, you know?
Can I throw out some stupid examples of what's not a burden?
Okay.
To show people how ridiculous this is? Okay, so when you have a child that can't swim, but they want to go play in the water at the lake, and you're like, okay, you can go play in the water, but I'm going to have you wear this life jacket because we both know you can't swim. And even though you don't think it's necessary, I'm wiser and I know that you need some protection. So there's a condition. You can only play in the water with a life jacket.
Right.
You're such an evil parent for burdening that child with a life jacket.
Right. Exactly.
That's one example. Another would be traffic lights. I always talk about traffic lights and traffic laws. You know, it's such a burden to have to obey these lights and sit there at a red light. Well, but it's not a burden when you don't get hit by the oncoming car or by the car coming from another green light. Or it's such a burden that I have to drive at a reasonable speed, 55, 65, 70 instead of 120. There are things that are put in place for our protection. And we have liberty because of that protection. It's not a burden.
Yep. So in 1 Corinthians 1:18, Shaul says, for the preaching of the cross, okay, that's in other words, the two sticks, okay, the preaching of the two sticks or the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved, it is the power of Elohim. So what does Paul mean when he's talking about the preaching of the cross? How do you preach the cross? Okay, as I've already talked about, self-denial. That word in Greek, staros, is not only a physical object, it's also, an action word like self-denial, right? A verb. So it's a noun, but it's also a verb. So he's saying for the preaching of self-denial is foolishness to those that are perishing. But to those of us that are saved, the preaching of self-denial is power, because there's power in self-denial. When you deny self, what takes over? When you deny yourself, what happens? The power of the Ruach HaKodesh comes in, swoops in, and empowers you. This is why the Apostle Paul or Shaul says that when I am weak, I am strong. He talks about in my weakness, I am strong. He says, because the foolishness of Elohim is wiser than men, and the weakness of Elohim is stronger than men. Right? Just find that passage when he talks about, I glory in my weakness. He says, we are fools for Messiah's sake, but you are wise in Messiah. We are weak, but you are strong. That's not the one that I wanted. This is the one I wanted right here. 2 Corinthians 12:10. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities. That word infirmities means weaknesses, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Messiah's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Why? Because, see, when we are weak, now what happens? The Ruach HaKodesh comes in and makes us strong.
Yeah, in other words, we're not doing things in our own strength. Our strength, our own deeds, our own efforts have already fallen short in the circumstance. So in that case, that's when we really cry out, Abba, Father, save me, and his strength comes forward.
Yeah, I think there's a passage where he says that strength is made perfect in weakness. Right here, 2 Corinthians 12:9. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Messiah may rest upon me. Okay? So in the Hebraic community, they want to say the cross is pagan, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, look, you are missing such a powerful message until you recognize that what this thing that he carried across his shoulder, this crossbeam, the cross is a powerful message. It is a message of self-denial. It is a message of him bringing together these two sticks, these two houses of Israel. And people say, well, it's not really a salvation issue. I don't care. It doesn't matter if he was nailed to two sticks or two trees, or if he was just nailed to a pole. Let's not worry about it. It's not that important. It's not a salvation issue. I always hear people say that. They want to be dismissive about stuff like that. I'm like, no, you don't get it. This is, it may not be a salvation issue, but you are missing out on so much prophetic revelation unless you recognize that he did die on a cross. 2 sticks, 2 trees. This is powerful. Powerful. So Shaul, Paul, was stating that he was preaching a message of self-denial. He was not speaking about an object that people wear around their necks. We're not supposed to make the cross into an object of worship or treat it like a good luck charm. I remember years ago watching that singer from the 1950s, Little Richard, and he was like on the 700 Club. And he was like saying that when he would fly an airplane, back in the day, he would always wear a cross around his neck and carry his Bible with him. But he never opened the Bible and read it. He said he believed that wearing this cross around his neck would protect him from dying in a plane crash. He had a sinful lifestyle, but he believed just wearing the cross was enough to keep him from dying in a plane crash. See, that's foolish. See, it's not about the object of the cross. It's not about wearing it around your neck like some kind of good luck charm. That's not what Paul is talking about when he's talking about the preaching of the cross. He's talking about the concept of self-denial. Okay? And so, when he talks about the two greatest commandments, this all points to the two houses of Israel and the two greatest commandments, the two sticks, the two trees. You see, the Jews, the Yehudim, they were focused on their vertical love for Yahuwah. They were, which is why they emphasized the first four commandments, okay, out of the 10 commandments. The Yehudim, the Jews, are very focused on the first four commandments, and that's wonderful. That's good. But the Goyim, the Gentiles, they seem to be more focused on their horizontal love for their neighbor. Did you ever notice that? Did you ever notice that, like in the Christian church, they're all about loving one another? That's all they talk about. Love your neighbor, loving each other, loving on their, loving other people. Okay. And that's good. That's wonderful. And, the Yehudim, they seem to be more focused on loving Yahuwah. Okay. And then that's wonderful too. But see, the vertical commandments having to do with, loving Yahuwah, the first four commandments of the 10, those are like the vertical commandments because they're directed upward towards Yahuwah. And then, the Goyim, they're more focused on the horizontal commandments. Those are the other 6 commandments. How to love your neighbor, right? But see, we need both. To have balance, we need both. We need to be keeping both commandments. That's what the cross paints a picture of. You have the vertical commandments by the stauros, and then you've got the horizontal commandments by the crossbeam.
Well, it's really popular today, too, in some camps. I won't say Christianity as a whole, but perhaps Christianity of the past.
Uh-huh.
Who's responsible for nailing Yahushua, Jesus, to the cross? People say, well, who's responsible? Because everyone wants to place blame somewhere. It's sort of natural. Humans are that way. We've already talked about there's, the two houses. Some people don't believe in two houses of Israel, the two camps, the northern kingdom and the southern, Judah and Israel. But there were 2 thieves on the cross. Why 2? Why not just 1?
Right.
Well, that was a picture of one house accepting Yahushua at the time, not completely, but they were more open to it. And the other house, who ultimately, at least the leaders of that house, Judah, crucified Messiah. Also with the 2 sticks. It wasn't just one branch that was responsible for his death. It wasn't just one branch that was on his shoulders. It was both branches. So it doesn't matter who at the time was in political office. It does in some contexts, but he died for the sins of the world. Both camps represent the entire sins of the whole world. No camp can say, well, it wasn't us, it was you guys. But historically, that's what's been said wrongly, pointing to the Jews. Well, it was you guys.
It was the Romans too.
It was the Romans too. I mean, the Romans were the mechanism by which it was able to happen.
Right. Yes, I mean, it was the Yehudim, and it really, to be honest, I mean, Caiaphas, he wasn't even really from the tribe of Levi. Many people don't realize this, but Caiaphas and many of those Pharisees, they were not Levites. The Romans installed them into office, but they were Edomites. The only ones that were legitimate Levites were Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. They were legitimate, Levites of the tribe of Levi. And John the Baptist, his father, Zechariah, they stoned him between the porch and the altar, like Yahushua said. He said, they stoned him between the porch and the altar. That's why John the Baptist, Yehukanan, his cousin, was not in the temple. Even though he was a Levite, he went out preaching in the wilderness. Okay? Because he didn't want the same thing to happen to him that they did to his father. Okay? So the thing is, when people say, the Jews crucified Yahushua. Well, remember what he said in Revelation 2:9 and Revelation 3:9? He says, I know them that say they are Yahudim or Jews, but they are the synagogue of Satan. Oh, man, those two verses are so worn out these days. Everybody thinks that that's talking about all the Jews, all the Yahudim. No, no, no. He's talking about those in the days of Messiah who they claimed that they were of the kingdom of Yehuda, but they were Roman plants. The Rome had put Caiaphas in charge as the high priest, but he wasn't a Levite. He wasn't a legitimate priest of the kingdom of Judah. I mean, yeah, legally, technically he was, but he wasn't of the right lineage. He was an Edomite. So when Yahushua said in Revelation 2:9 and 3:9, I know them that say they are Yahudim, but they are not. They are the synagogue of Satan. Everybody thinks, oh, it's talking about all Jews. No, it's not. He's talking about the ones that weren't really from the tribe of Levi.
It's the same anywhere. Those who are supposed to serve the people, whether it's a judge or a congressman or a senator, those who claim to be about service and love and duty, but they're really about self. It's fraud.
But they weren't even of the right physical lineage anyway, like Caiaphas wasn't.
Right. Dan goes on to say in the chat that Caiaphas tore his robe, so he wasn't even qualified to be high priest at the time of the sacrifice. So Yahushua was high priest over his own sacrifice.
Exactly. Totally.
Amen, Dan.
That's a really good point. So we see this in the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10:30 through 37. The Samaritan, which, the 10 lost tribes of Israel, when they were divorced by Yahuwah, they were called Gentiles, okay? Because they went into exile with the Assyrians, so they became known as Gentiles. So the Samaritan, Gentile, cared for a complete stranger who was beaten and left for dead on the side of the road, while the Levite was too preoccupied with religious things to care for the stranger. Of course, the Levite didn't want to touch a dead body because that would make him unclean and he wouldn't be fit to go to the temple and do his duties. So that's understandable why, technically speaking, the Levite wouldn't care for the Samaritan, the man that was left for dead on the side of the road. But what did our Messiah talk about? He bore our burdens for us in the same way that Simon of Cyrene, who was a Gentile, carried his burden for him. And likewise, the Good Samaritan, who was a Gentile, cared for the stranger that was beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. And now you have Simon of Cyrene, a Gentile, helping out this man, our Messiah, who's carrying this cross. I mean, he was telling them this as an indictment against them. Like, you guys are supposed to be righteous. You're supposed to be the kingdom of Judah. You're supposed to be the ones that are the keepers of the Torah. And yet, sometimes the Gentiles behave more righteously than you do. Because why? They had more vertical love, more horizontal love for their neighbor. Whereas the Levites were so preoccupied with doing everything religious, vertical, their vertical love for Yahuwah, but they ignored their love for their neighbor. So there has to be this balance, right? We can't just be all about, loving Yahuwah, outwardly speaking for everybody to see. But are we really loving him if we're not taking care of our neighbor? See?
It's interesting, too, because, we've talked about this before over the years on air and stuff, that there's reasons that the priest wouldn't want to defile himself. But we also know that within Torah, there's perhaps things that could have been done to mitigate him being unclean and yet still getting somebody to help. But we also know the Torah allows for the saving of life.
That's right.
If you're going to break Torah in one sense to fulfill Torah in another sense,
saving life always trumps everything. Yep.
That's why even rescuing an ox from the ditch.
That's right. On a Sabbath day.
Animals aren't to be tortured or to be left suffering. Mm-hmm. For that matter, if an animal's in a stall and there's no way for it to be fed, you're not supposed to not feed the animal because it's the Sabbath.
Right. So Yahushua didn't add any heavy yokes. He didn't add the heavy yokes. He didn't make it harder to keep the Torah, right? Like the Pharisees did. They put a fence around the Torah. They made it harder than it was meant to be. He makes it easy and light. He, didn't add extra rules and regulations. So what is this a prophetic picture of? Well, we see that the stauros, right, which is translated in English as cross, the stauros that was already standing there at the execution site represents the house of Judah. Okay, the stick that was already at home in Jerusalem. You could actually see it both ways. So I'm gonna explain this. So just bear with me. So we can actually see that the stauros was like the house of Judah because they were already standing, right? Standing there at home in Jerusalem. But the stick of Ephraim was afar off, right? Like the prodigal son. So we could say that Yahushua made the journey and went afar off. In other words, he went afar off from Jerusalem, just like Ephraim, the prodigal son who was afar off. He made the journey, right? And so Messiah came for what? The 10 northern tribes who were afar off. He made the journey for them by carrying the stick of Ephraim to the stick of Judah in order to make them one stick by the cross or the Taw. Okay, Simon of Cyrene, being a Gentile, he's another clue. But then we could look at it the other way too. What if we look at it this way? What if it was that the stauros that was already standing there was Ephraim? Because Ephraim was afar off. And now he's coming from Jerusalem carrying the crossbeam across his shoulder, and he's taking the stick of Judah to the stick of Ephraim, who's already afar off at the place of the skull, right? And he's bringing the stick of Judah to the stick of Ephraim. So you could actually see it both ways,
What's that scripture about the lawgiver will never...
That's Genesis 49:10.
Yeah, so how does it go?
It's in Genesis 49:10. It says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. Right here. The scepter shall not depart from Yehudah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be.
I couldn't think of the word scepter for the life of me.
Yeah.
Yeah, the scepter represents the kingdom, the kingship.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Jerusalem is where David ruled from. So even though Rome was in occupation, you could also see, again, where that stauros, that stake, is sort of a shadow picture of the scepter that was already there. And then they brought in the other one. They brought in Ephraim because Ephraim played its part as well.
Right. So, you can look at it both ways, but I think, personally speaking, him bringing the stick of Judah to the stick of Ephraim might be a little more accurate picture because you got to understand, they put the beam on his shoulder while he was still in the city limits of Jerusalem, and then he carries it out. He carries it out of the city, right? And he makes the journey and goes afar off to the place of the skull. And what's already there is Ephraim. So, in other words, he brought the stick of Judah to the stick of Ephraim. So, you can really see it both ways. But, so the burden or the yoke of Ephraim was made easy and light. And we see 2 oxen yoked together, right? And, we've often heard the phrase, do not be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. Well, what does it mean to be unequally yoked? Well, to be unequally yoked would be if you put an ox together with a donkey, because an ox and a donkey don't work together very well. Donkeys are kind of stubborn. They have a mind of their own. 2 oxen will move together at the right. They will pace each other. They will help pace each other. They will work very well together.
Yeah, the primary, they have the same personality, so they're both likely to do what they're told.
Mm-hmm.
by the reins, and the other is that they are the same stature. They have the same stride. They have the same power.
Right.
You're not going to be constantly pulling to one side because one animal's stronger and one's weaker.
So the 10 northern tribes of Israel who were divorced by Yahuwah, they became known as Ephraim because it was Joseph's son, Ephraim, who became their tribal leader, according to Bereshit, Genesis 48, 18 through 22. Ephraim, he was born in Egypt, and he was accustomed to being in bondage or slavery to paganism and idolatry. This is why oftentimes in Scripture we see that Ephraim is likened unto a bull or a heifer who is under a heavy yoke of bondage or slavery. It says this in Hosea chapter 10, 11. And why is he in bondage? It's because the two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, okay, or the Yehudim, they've added extra man-made laws to the Torah of Moses, which this is called the oral law, the Talmud, right? They put a fence around the Torah, okay? And so Ephraim decided that it was too burdensome to keep the commandments because they added extra rules. They made it harder to keep the Torah, okay? So this is why in 1 Kings 12, the two houses of Israel, in other words, Ephraim and Yehuda, they split. Two kingdoms split under King Jeroboam and Rehoboam. King Solomon had placed heavy burdens, taxes on the people of Israel. So he, King Solomon was of the tribe of Judah, right? He placed heavy burdens on the people of Israel. In other words, he taxed them heavily so he could build these heathen temples for his many wives. But after he died, his son Rehoboam refused to lighten their taxes. They said, they sent letters to Rehoboam. King Jeroboam sent letters to Rehoboam and said, "We will serve you if you will lighten our burdens." And he refused. And so this is why the two houses of Israel split. See, this is a metaphor for what happened later on in history when the house of Judah placed heavy religious burdens on the people of Israel as well. So you have King Solomon placing heavy tax burdens on the people, but in the time of Messiah, the burdens were heavy religious rules. Okay? So as a result, King Jeroboam invented pagan holidays patterned after Baal. He set up a golden calf at Mount Ephraim and at Dan. To this day, many Christians fall under the covering of Ephraim because they keep the pagan holidays of Baal. In other words, Christmas, Easter, Halloween, Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's Day, all these extra biblical, extra holidays that are not biblical. And so what was our Messiah's mission at his first coming? He came as Messiah ben Joseph. In other words, the suffering servant. And in order to bring the 10 lost tribes of Israel back to the Father's instructions, his Torah. Therefore, Messiah bore the burden of Ephraim across his shoulder when he journeyed to the Storos, the pole, as he carried the crossbeam for Ephraim. See, this crossbeam was a burden across his shoulders, just like in the picture of these oxen that are yoked with a burden on their shoulders. See, here you have a picture of Messiah as the red heifer, and he's carrying this burden across his shoulder to make of the two one new man. You see that? he carries this burden across his shoulder to make of the two houses one. This yoke makes the two oxen like one animal working in sync with each other. Isn't that amazing? So it's so important that we understand this picture of the cross because we will miss all these prophetic pictures if we think he was nailed to a single pole or to a stake. We'll miss all the beauty in the prophetic pictures that it paints, that he was nailed to two sticks, two trees, right? Two trees. So we can see a prophetic picture from these verses that the house of Ephraim, the non-Jewish believers, that what we call Christians, They are still in bondage to their stiff-necked rebellion against the Father's instructions. However, in these last days, there is a huge revival of coming back to Torah, and we see it all over the world. Christians are coming out of the mother harlot system, and they're coming into obedience to Torah. In Hosea 10:11, it says, "And Ephraim is as a heifer that is taught, and loves to tread out the corn. But I have passed over upon her fair neck. I will make Ephraim to ride. Yehuda, Judah, shall plow, and Jacob, shall break his clods." In Devarim, Deuteronomy 33:17, it says, "His glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth, and they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and are the thousands of Manasseh." You see, because Ephraim was born in Egypt, he's accustomed. I don't know why I read that as accused. I read it fast. Because Ephraim was born in Egypt, he is accustomed to being in bondage to pagan idolatry. But this prophecy reveals that Yehuda, Judah, will plow the harvest field for Ephraim, right? And the sons of Jacob, will make the soil ready for the seeds. They will join in the last days to help Ephraim's burden and to make it light.
Something you just said just clicked with me. Ephraim is used to being in bondage to idolatry.
Yep.
They've been conditioned.
Yes.
They're accustomed to it. As such, they don't see how wrong it is.
Right.
They don't see how Yahuwah's...
Yeah, because to them it's normal. It's the norm,
It's normal. And the little things that to a Yahudi, to someone who's not done that, they're like, no, that comes from this. I'm not going to do that. And they're like, what are you talking about? You're making a big deal out of nothing.
Yeah.
Ephraim doesn't clearly have the eyes to see it all.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in Jeremiah 31:18, it says, "I have surely heard Ephraim bemoaning himself thus. You have chastised me, and I was chastised as a bullock unaccustomed to the yoke. Turn you me, and I shall be turned, for you are Yahuwah, my Elohim." In other words, Ephraim is not used to being disciplined by Yahuwah. That's why he's unaccustomed to the yoke, because he's used to doing his own thing. The yoke is like a burden on Ephraim's shoulder. See, the yoke is like the Torah, right? See, here's a yoke. This is what a yoke looks like. In other words, this is a picture of the crossbeam that Messiah carries across his shoulder, but there's two different pieces to hold the neck of two different animals together. So what this yoke represents the Torah, Yahushua carrying the burden across his shoulder, because Ephraim complained and bemoaned about the Torah. Oh, the burden of Yahuwah. It's the burden. It sounds like Christianity today. Oh, the law's a burden. It's too hard, But see, this burden he carries across his shoulder, this yoke that he says is easy and light. He carried it for us. He makes it possible for us to keep it, because now we have his spirit within us, and he's written his Torah in our hearts and in our minds. So he's made it easy for us. But what is the prophetic purpose of this? It brings the two houses together. The house of Yehuda, the house of Ephraim. See that? The yoke is easy and light. And not only is it easy and light, it brings unity to the house. The house. See, we can't have unity until we all start recognizing that Yahuwah bore this burden for us. And he tells us to take up our cross, and die daily to deny ourselves. See, we are yoked together. The two houses of Israel are meant to be yoked together. But what do we see nowadays, even in the Hebraic roots movement? Everybody thinks the Jews are the synagogue of Satan. Everybody in this Hebraic roots movement are like, oh, those aren't the real Jews living in Israel. Really? If they're not the real Yahudim living there right now, then tell me why that there are people in the modern state of Israel today that are coming to know the Messiah. For 2,000 years, we've never heard of Jews, Yahudim, coming to know the Messiah. But now, even Orthodox Jews are coming to know him. Okay? So prophecy is being fulfilled. But see, if we behave like this and we say, oh, the Jews, they're the synagogue of Satan. Oh, they're not the real Jews. They're the fake Jews. I'm so tired of hearing this. What are we doing? We're denying the cross. We're denying that Yahushua has made us one body by his cross. See, we're denying the yoke that puts the two, that is meant to put the two together again. Okay? So we're never going to be a house that's undivided. We're never going to be back in unity together until we submit to the cross, the denial, the self-denial of Messiah. This is why the Apostle Paul, Shaul, says that he preached the cross. Why would he preach the cross? He was talking about self-denial. We all have to deny ourselves and die to self and prefer one another and put others ahead of ourselves. But we're not doing that. Everybody in this movement is being selfish, 2 Corinthians 6:14, he says, be you not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship has righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion has light with darkness? See, if we yoke together 2 oxen or 2 donkeys, they work well together. But if we yoke 1 donkey and 1 ox or bull, then they will not be compatible. Nothing will get done. The field does not get plowed. A donkey and a lamb are both used to symbolize the firstborn of the house of Judah. Okay? Genesis 49:11, Exodus 13:13, and Zechariah 9:9. But the bull is symbolic of Ephraim, the 10 lost tribes, according to Hosea 4:16 and Hosea 10:11. Sheep are obedient. They obey the voice of the shepherd. But bulls and donkeys, they're stubborn. They're stiff-necked. They need to be yoked in order to be made obedient so they can plow. But a bull and a donkey usually cannot be yoked together, for they are unequally yoked. See, our Messiah performed the role of the Passover lamb. Oops, my cursor just got away from me here. Sorry. Our Messiah performed the role of the Passover lamb during Passover, but he also performed the role of the red heifer, which is the only sacrifice that is to be done outside of the camp. The red heifer sacrifice was to be done by the priests in the temple when the altar became defiled. You see, the whole nation shouted, "Crucify him." And when they did that, their whole altar was defiled that year. The whole nation became guilty of innocent blood. And that's when the Torah says you must escort a red heifer outside the camp. And that's the only sacrifice that's done outside the camp, is the red heifer. And so Yahushua had to portray the role of the red heifer in order to cleanse the altar. So the priests were commanded to escort the heifer outside the camp. They were to kill the heifer and then burn the heifer down into ashes. They would mix the ashes of the heifer with water, and then they used this as a cleansing solution to cleanse the articles of the temple and the altar. The instructions are found in Numbers 19. See, the red heifer had to be perfect. Not one white hair could be found on this heifer. It had to be a perfect red heifer without spot or blemish, just like the Passover lamb. See, the instructions for Yom Kippur in Leviticus 16 say that the priest in the temple had to first sanctify himself with a bullock or a heifer sacrifice, and then he was qualified to kill the sacrificial goat for the nation of Israel. So were the 2 sacrifices involved on Yom Kippur. There was the bullock and there was the goat, the sacrificial goat. And then, of course, the scapegoat was sent away in the wilderness. But that's for another teaching. But see, his final act was to mix the blood of the heifer. The high priest was supposed to mix the blood of the heifer or the bullock with the blood of the Yom Kippur goat, and he would sprinkle the mixed blood together on the altar. That's in Leviticus 16. And what is that a prophetic picture of? You see, the heifer, the bull, you know that Leah, her name means cow? Yes, it does. And did you know that Rachel, her name means lamb or goat? So Leah, it is a prophetic picture of the 10 lost tribes of Ephraim, the 10 northern tribes. She was more fruitful. She had more children, just like Ephraim. Ephraim, his name means double fruit. That's what the name Ephraim means. He's more fruitful. Okay? And he represents the Gentiles. But Rachel, she represents the house of Judah. Even though she didn't give birth to a son, Judah was not, she didn't bear Judah, right? But she bore Benjamin. And see, Benjamin, Judah, he made a promise to his father Jacob and said, I will be Benjamin's keeper. Remember when they had to go back to Egypt and buy grain? And Joseph said, you will not see me unless your brother Benjamin is with you. So Jacob's afraid to send Benjamin to Egypt. But what does Judah say? He promises his father Jacob. He says, I will be Benjamin's keeper forever. So moving forward in history, what happened? After the two kingdoms split, the two southern tribes were Benjamin and Judah. See, Benjamin and Judah have been together ever since. Ever since Judah makes this promise to Jacob, Benjamin and Judah have been together. So, in other words, Rachel, why was her body buried in Bethlehem, Judah? And why is there that prophecy in Matthew's gospel after King Herod kills all the baby boys? It says, Rachel weeping for her children because they were not. And that prophecy comes from Jeremiah. Jeremiah says the same thing. He says, Rachel weeping for her children because they were not. Well, Rachel didn't give birth to Judah, but she did give birth to Benjamin. And so Benjamin and Judah have become one. And so because Rachel's body was buried in Bethlehem, Judah, therefore the children of Judah and Benjamin are now called Rachel's children. So Rachel represents the goat. Leah represents the heifer. Okay, when the priest sprinkled the blood of these two animals together, that's a prophetic picture that when Messiah comes back on Yom Kippur, he's going to be that high priest that's going to mix the two family bloodlines together. He's going to mix the kingdom of Judah with the house of Ephraim, and they're going to become one kingdom, one house again. In other words, the two sticks. You see that? Okay? So when Messiah returns on that day of vengeance, this is going to be Yom Kippur. He will make the two families, the two houses of Israel, one house, one family, one bride, one stick in his hand. In other words, the blood of the heifer symbolizes the house of Ephraim. The blood of the Yom Kippur goat symbolizes the house of Yehudah. See, the prophecy of Ezekiel 37, 16 through 18 will be fulfilled on that day. Okay? So I like this picture because it shows that it was actually two different trees. Prophetically, two trees for the two houses, you know? Let's go to Ezekiel 37 and you'll see what I'm talking about. Right here in Ezekiel 37, in verse 16, he says, Moreover, you son of man, take you one stick. And that word stick is number 6086. It's eights. Just like, the way you would pronounce the number 8, right? It's eights, but it's spelled E-T-S, etz, in modern Hebrew. But as you can see, it means a tree, okay? From its firmness, hence wood, plural, sticks, carpenter, gallows, pine, plank, staff, stalk, stick, stock, timber, tree, wood. These are just synonyms, but primarily it's a tree. The word eitz is a tree. Okay. We could effectively say take one tree, okay, and write upon it for Yehuda, right? And for the children of Israel, his companions. Then take another tree or stick, right? Etz, and write upon it for Yehusaph, Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel, his companions. And join them one to another into one tree, and they shall become one in your hand. And when the children of your people shall speak unto you, saying, will you not show us what you mean by these? Say unto them, thus says Yahuwah Elohim, behold, I will take the tree, and right here, before the word stick or tree is the Aleph and the Taw and the Wah. The Wah, Aleph, and Taw, okay? The stick of Yehusaph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel, his fellows, and will put them with him, even with the stick of Yehuda, and make them one stick, and they shall be one in my hand. And so my only reason for showing this is just that I think prophetically it kind of sends the message. I'm not saying this is exactly what the Roman cross looked like, but I just like the fact that it portrays two trees. So the house of Yehuda have been given the scepter to rule over these other tribes. They were already keeping the first of the the first 4 commandments out of the 10. However, the kingdom of Judah, Yehuda, often neglected the other 6 commandments, which tells us to love your neighbor as yourself. But our Messiah had to rebuke the scribes and Pharisees of his day, okay, because they added so many traditions, making it difficult for the lost tribes to return and to obey. So these lost tribes were no longer keeping the Sabbath. They were no longer keeping the biblical feasts. They were still afar off from the covenant. See, they were not loving their neighbor. Okay? This is why Messiah made that journey. He carried the tree or the stick of Judah across his shoulders. In other words, the Xylon. Okay? He was fulfilling the prophecy of Ezekiel by carrying the stick of Judah and the stick of Ephraim. He made them one stick. The horizontal tree, the stick represents our horizontal relationship with our fellow man. This is the greatest commandment, which tells us to love your neighbor, or the second greatest commandment, I should say. The second greatest commandment. Judah was and still is deficient in this area. Therefore, our Messiah had to carry the horizontal stick for Judah. Okay? He carried the horizontal stick because the horizontal stick for Judah has to do with our horizontal relationship with each other, whereas the vertical stick, the house of Ephraim, where are they lacking? They don't think we have to keep the feasts anymore. They don't think we have to keep the Sabbath. They think it's okay to still have graven images. They still take his name in vain. They don't use his sacred name. They call him by these vain, empty titles like Lord and God and stuff like that. So the house of Ephraim, they are not as good at keeping the first 4 commandments out of the 10. They're better about the latter 6 commandments. So you see, these 2 sticks, these 2 trees are indicative of the 2 greatest commandments. So our Messiah brought the stick of Judah to Ephraim, who represents the vertical tree that was already standing there at the place of the skull. So you could look at it both ways, right? Ephraim was not good about obeying the first 4 commandments out of the 10. However, they oftentimes demonstrated more love for their fellow man, as I previously mentioned in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Therefore, the upright pole or the vertical stick represents Ephraim. Ephraim has been deficient in their vertical relationship with Yahuwah by neglecting the Sabbath, and the feasts. So when our Messiah finally arrived at that place where the Stauros was standing, he had the xylon, or the crossbeam, across his shoulder. This was fastened to the already standing Stauros. This is how he demonstrated that the two sticks of Yehuda and Ephraim are becoming one stick in his hand. He literally had his hands nailed to these two sticks. One stick in his hand.
I was just thinking Ephraim, or the Western culture, or Christianity, whatever you want to call it, by and large, the attitude is Yahuwah knows my heart.
Yeah.
And they don't want to think of Yahuwah as being legalistic, and he's not legalistic for legalism's sake.
Right.
But contract, has its stipulations.
Yep.
So he is legalistic because Satan will accuse us, and without the contract, there's no mechanism for Yahuwah to judge the righteous or unrighteous, or worthy or unworthy, when Satan makes the accusations. So Ephraim, in saying that he knows my heart, we all and they would probably grab onto the scripture that talks about Yahuwah winks at our ignorance. That certainly represents he knows my heart.
Yeah.
The heart of a child. They're ignorant. And so while that's true, that's profound, because if he says he winks at our ignorance, what does he do when we're not ignorant? Right? That's the question begging to be asked.
Right.
Because if he winks at our ignorance, that means he's not busting our chops like he could because we're ignorant. But when we're not ignorant, the point is that he doesn't wink at our knowledge.
Yeah, well, it says that in Hebrews. It says that, if we sin willfully, it's in Hebrews chapter 10. For if we sin willfully, after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there remains no more sacrifice for sins. Right?
Exactly.
So I wanted to show you guys, this is what the ancient lamb, the way they cooked the Passover lamb in ancient times, they literally would put a cross to open up the cavity of the lamb. They would use a cross made out of a long pomegranate stick. 2 pomegranate sticks were used to hold the lamb upright and plant it into the ground. And here's another picture that I found. This is, from some place in Italy called Piatelli Vineyards. Of course, they, learned this method from ancient times, but they still do it this way. They're cooking lamb over an open fire on what looks like a cross, right? This is how ancient Israel did it. They opened up the cavity of the lamb, and that way the lamb got cooked very rapidly. If they would have kept it together, it would have taken hours. See how almost flat this lamb looks? This lamb is totally opened up and like almost flat.
And we're not saying that Yahuwah was hung upside down like that lamb on the left side is upside down.
No, of course not. Yeah. So, yeah, this is the ancient way that they actually cooked lamb. So there's so many prophetic things pointing to this idea of the cross. And last week we talked about the fiery serpent on the pole, which I've already gone through that last week, and how the apostle Yahuchanan John said, and as Moshe lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Oftentimes, I think I'm just going to run through the whole teaching very fast, very rapidly, but I sense the Ruach having me go into, other things and that are related to the teaching. And so today I just really felt like I really wanted to emphasize this whole self-denial concept. And here's another thing that's important. In Exodus 13:13, we are told to redeem the firstborn of a donkey for Passover with a lamb. And all donkeys have this cross on their backs. That's by design. Yahuwah designed it that way on purpose, because the donkey represents stiff-necked Israel, right? And all of us are prideful and stubborn human beings. It says right here, Exodus 13:13, and every firstling of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, and if you will not redeem it, then you shall break his neck, and all the firstborn of man among your children shall you redeem. And then Exodus 34:20, it says, but the firstling of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, and if you redeem him not, then shall you break his neck. All the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem, and none shall appear before me empty. So it is for this reason that our Messiah rode through Jerusalem on the colt of a donkey 4 days before he was to be sacrificed as the Passover lamb. Here's another picture up close of the back of a donkey, and look, he's got a cross on his back. That's by design. So the Lamb of Elohim rode through Jerusalem on the back of a donkey to show that he was the one that was going to redeem stiff-necked Israel, the donkey. In Zechariah 9:9, there's a prophecy. It says, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes unto you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon a donkey and upon a colt, the foal of a donkey. And then that prophecy is repeated in Matthew 21:5. Tell you the daughter of Zion, behold, your king comes unto you, meek and sitting upon a donkey and a colt, the foal of a donkey. And then, of course, it's repeated again in John Yehukanan 12:15. So this is really fascinating. So when people try and tell you that the cross is pagan, well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that the devil has hijacked and tried to turn it into something pagan. But guess what? Yahuwah is the one who gave us this symbol, the symbol of the Taw, and it has profound and prophetic meaning behind it. So as long as you don't bow down and worship a wooden cross and pray to a wooden cross, you're not committing idolatry. So, I think it's important that we let people know this is not a pagan symbol unless you decide to make it one and treat it as such. It's all in how we use it. So that's it for today, and we'll continue next week with part 3 because there's a little more to cover.
Yahuwah bless you and keep you. Yahuwah make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. Yahuwah lift up his countenance upon you and give you shalom. We hope you've enjoyed today's broadcast and that you are encouraged in your walk with Messiah. For more teachings, subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell to be notified of our latest content. Visit Maria's many blogs at doubleportioninheritance.com. That's doubleportioninheritance.com. This ministry is made possible by the prayers and support of listeners like you. To make a donation by PayPal or Venmo.com, use the email address doubleportioninheritance@gmail.com. That's doubleportioninheritance@gmail.com. On behalf of Maria and Gary at Double Portion Inheritance Ministries, may Yahuwah bless you.